Developed by Don't Nod Entertainment and published by Square Enix in 2018 for the personal computer, Sony PlayStation 4, Microsoft Xbox One, was Life is Strange 2. The game focused on the main characters, whom were brothers, being that of Sean and Daniel Diaz, whom, as depicted in events of the story, dealt with the tragic murder of their father, on the brothers having no other choice but to flee their home in Seattle, Washington within the United States to their father's ancestral home of Puerto Lobos in Mexico. Depicted very early in the story was the minor character of Lyla Park, whom was Sean's best friend. Through events in the story, their friendship was broken, and Sean had no other choice but to flee with Daniel to Mexico. An interesting theory had it that Lyla was actually an interesting supporting character to Sean Diaz, and the abrupt breaking off of the friendship was something that had been considered wasted potential in terms of character relationships for Sean within the game. Due to the chaotic and unpredictable nature of the circumstances that Sean and Daniel were in, it was actually mentioned that Lyla suffers from depression and insomnia, which would have clearly gotten worse if Sean weren't to have kept in contact with her after he was forced to flee Seattle with Daniel. The player had the option of keeping in contact with her throughout the story after leaving Seattle, but according to official player data of the game, less than half of the player base who had experienced the game technically kept in contact with her, as what would have happened to her exactly would have been that her condition would have deteriorated to such an extent that she would have been placed within a mental institution. However, dialogue mentioned in the game hinted that Lyla had already been within a mental hospital prior to the events of the story. Theories further had it that if the player had stayed in contact with Lyla through other means, it was theorized through dialogue as well as other circumstances that even though both were best friends, that there might have been potential feelings that the both of them had for one another. As from details depicted within the game, even though Sean and Daniel left Seattle, Lyla tried her best to defend the both of them from accusations, as well as negative social media, but it took a massive amount of personal risk for her to do so. As eventually, through most scenarios of the game, Sean and Daniel escape to Mexico and start a new life there, with everything and everyone that the both of them knew, had cared about, within the United States were ultimately abandoned. But in one of the rarest scenarios within the game, if Sean had decided to turn himself into the police, and Daniel agreed with Sean's request, as well as Sean keeping in contact with Lyla, then she'll be depicted waiting for him once he had gone out of the gaol, a period of 15 years later. This was a rare outcome that most players would never experience or even know about, so it's not exactly considered in continuity for the game's ending, as most scenarios had Sean and Daniel escape to Mexico as the ending for the game's story. Theorists mention that Lyla was perhaps the best female interest for Sean in the game, as there were few other choices that he could have had in terms of romantic interests or even friendships. None were at the same tier of devotion as Lyla, as all of these factors were reinforced with the concept that Lyla was an abandoned character that had some potential for further development in terms of a relationship with Sean. But the abrupt breaking off of the relationship between Sean and Lyla were more than just fan speculations. According to scenario writers for Life is Strange 2, Lyla's story with Sean was originally supposed to have concluded with the optional phone call that she had with Sean early in the game. However, due to positive feedback for Lyla as a character, the developers of the game decided to slightly expand upon the relationship between her and Sean, in terms of Lyla defending Sean and Daniel through internet message boards and commenting to local authorities, even publicly in terms of police or news outlets. As even though Lyla had tried to defend Sean and Daniel, the main premise of the game were that the Diaz brothers had lost everything that they had and would never be able to get back what they had lost. Sometimes a character can be forgotten because they were used to visualize another character's loss of family, friends, and everything that they had in their life.